Hard Lens Media.
That's right.
That's right. He's going to do a fantastic reading, and I'm super excited for it. And
No problem.
Kick it off.
All right. 1, 2, 1, 2. Can you guys hear me loud and clear? All right, fantastic. My name is Kit Cabello. I'm the host of Hard Lens Media. We are a YouTube channel. We've been around for 7 years. I'm also the co-founder of 99 Perspective Studios with my colleague Daniel Lupker. And so we've been doing this. My family's been in Chicago for 4 generations deep. And so, without further ado, here at the Monkey's Paw, I am going to be reading The Monkey's Paw. So, like what I like to say to my viewing audience when I go live every Monday through Friday at 9 a.m. Central, good morning, my lovelies, my mornings, my sunshines. Good evening, my lovelies, my evenings, my moons. So, remember, the human sacrifices will happen after the reading, so there you go. That's not a joke. But without further ado, I don't think the mic is... Okay, now the mic is on. Okay, there you go. Gotta be careful how I hold this. So, without further ado, in a 3, a 2, and an uno, let's get started with The Monkey's Paw, read by Kit Cabello. That's me. Without the night was cold and wet, but in the small parlor of the Librarian Lavinia, the blinds were drawn and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were at chess. The former, who possessed ideas about the game involving radical chances, putting his king in such sharp and unnecessary perils, ooh la la, that it even provoked comment from the white-haired old lady, knitting placidly by the fire. Hark at the wind, said Mr. White, who, having seen a fatal mistake after it was too late, was ambidextrous in preventing his son from seeing it. I'm listening, said the latter, grimly surveying the board as he stretched out his hand. Check. Old man got defeated by the young boy. Never underestimate a young boy. I should hardly think that he's come tonight, said his father, with his hand poised over the board. Make, replied the son. That's the worst of living so far, bawled Mr. White, with sudden unlooked-for violence. Of all the beastly, slushy, out-of-the-way places to live in, this is the worst. Past a bog, and the roads a torrent. I don't know what people are thinking about. I suppose because only 2 houses in the road are let, they think it doesn't matter. Never mind, dear, said his wife soothingly. Perhaps you'll win the next one. Oh, what a shame. Always good to have a good wife at your side. Mr. White looked up sharply, just in time to intercept a knowing glance between mother and son. The words died on his lips, and he hid a guilty grin as his thin gray beard. I should be wearing my glasses. There he is, said Herbert White at the gate, banged too loudly, and heavy footsteps came toward the door. The old man rose with hospitable haste, and opening the door was heard cuddling with a new arrival. The new arrival was condoled with himself, so that Miss White said, "Tut, tut," and coughed gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, burly man, beady-eyed and rubicund of visage. Sergeant Major Morris, he said, introducing him. The Sergeant Major took his hands, taking the prophet seat by the fire, watched contentedly as his host got out the whiskey and tumblers and stood a small copper kettle on the fire. So cheers with your whiskey, my lovelies. At the 3rd glass, his eyes got brighter, and he began to talk. The little family circle regarding with eager interest this visitor from distant parts as he squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of wild scenes and doughty deeds, of wars and plagues and strange peoples. 21 years of it, said Mr. White, nodding at his wife and son. When he went away, he was a slip of youth in the warehouse. Now look at him. He don't look to have taken much harm, said Miss White politely. I'd like to go to India myself, said the old man, just to look around a bit, you know. Better where you are, said the sergeant major, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass, sighing softly, shook again. I should have seen those old temples and fakirs and jugglers, said the old man. What was that you started telling me the other day about the monkey's paw or something, Morse? Nothing, the soldier said hastily. Leastways, nothing worth hearing. Monkey's paw, said Mrs. White curiously. Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps, said the sergeant major, offhandedly, of course. His three listeners leaned forward eagerly. The visitor, absent-mindedly, put his empty glass to his lips and then set it down again. His host filled it for him again. How lovely. Such a good host. To look at it, said the sergeant major, fumbling in his pocket. It's just an ordinary little paw, dried to a mummy. He took something out of his pocket and proffered it. Mrs. White drew back with a grimace, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously. And what is there special about it? Inquired Mr. White, as he took it from his son and, having examined it, placed it upon the table. It had a spell put on it by an old fat guy, said the sergeant major, a very holy man. He wanted to show the fate ruled people's lives, and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it so that 3 separate men could each have 3 wishes from it. His manners were so impressive that his hearers were conscious of the light laughter that jarred somewhat. Well, why don't you have 3, sir? Said Herbert White cleverly. The soldier regarded him the way that middle age is wont to regard presumptuous youth. I have, he said quietly, and his blotchy face whitened. And did you really have 3 wishes granted? Asked Mrs. White. I did, said the sergeant major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth. And has anybody else wished? Persisted the old lady. The first man had 3 wishes, yes, was the reply. I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was for death. That's how I got the paw. His tones were so grave that a hush fell upon the group. If you've had 3 wishes, it's no good to you now, then, Morris, said the old man at last. What do you keep it for? The soldier shook his head. Fancy, I suppose, he said slowly. I did have some idea of selling it, but I don't think I will. It caused me enough mischief already. Besides, people won't buy. They think it's a fairy tale, some of them, and those who do think anything of it want to try it first and pay me afterwards. If you could have another 3 wishes, said the old man, eyeing him keenly, would you have them? I don't know, said the other. I don't know. Be careful what you wish for. He took the paw and dangled it between his forefinger and thumb, suddenly threw it upon the fire. White, with a slight cry, stooped down and snatched it off. Better let it burn, said the soldier solemnly. If you don't want it, Morris, said the other, give it to me. I won't, said his friend doggedly. I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Pitch it on the fire like a sensible man. The other shook his head and examined his possession closely. How do you do it? He inquired. Hold it up in your right hand and wish aloud, said the sergeant major. But I warn you of its consequences. Sounds like Arabian Nights, said Mrs. White, as she rose and began to set up the supper. Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me? Her husband drew the talisman from his pocket, and all 3 burst into laughter as the sergeant major, with a look of alarm on his face, caught him by the arm. If you must wish, he said gruffly, wish for something sensible. How do you do that? Mr. White dropped it back in his pocket and, placing chairs, motioned to his friend to the table. In the business of supper, the talisman was partly forgotten, and afterward the three sat listening in an enthralled fashion to a second installment of the soldier's adventures in India. If the tale about the monkey's paw is more truthful than those he's been telling us, said Herbert, as the door closed behind their guests, just in time to catch the last train, we shan't make much of it. Did you give anything for it, Father? Inquired Mrs. White, regarding her husband closely. A trifle, said he, coloring slightly. He didn't want it, but I made him take it, and he pressed me again to throw it away. Likely, said Herbert, with pretend horror. Why, we're going to be rich and famous and happy. Wish to be emperor, Father, to begin with. Then you can't be henpecked. He darted around the table, pursued by a malignant Miss White, armed with the anti-macassar. Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it dubiously. I don't know what to wish for. That's a fact, he said slowly. It seems like I've got all I want. And you should be content with that, if you have all that you want. If you only cleared the house, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you, said Herbert, with his hand on his shoulder. Well, wish for 200 pounds then. That'll just do it. Father, smiling shamefacedly at his own credulity, held up the talisman as his son, with a solemn face, somewhat marred by a wink at his mother, sat down and struck a few impressive chords. I wish for 200 pounds, said the old man distinctly. A fine crash from the piano greeted his words, interrupted by a shuddering cry from the old man. His wife and son ran toward him. It moved, he cried, with a glance of disgust at the object as it lay on the floor. As I wish, it twisted in my hand like a snake. Well, I don't see the money. Where's the money? Said his son, as he picked it up and placed it on the table. And I bet I never shall. It must have been your fancy, Father, said his wife, regarding him anxiously. He shook his head. Never mind, though. There's no harm done, but it gave me a shook all the same. They sat down by the fire again, while the two men finished their pipes. Outside, the wind was higher than ever, and the old man stared nervously at the sound of the door banging upstairs. A silence unusual and depressing settled on all three, which lasted until the old couple rose to retire for the rest of the night. I expect you'll find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed, said Herbert, as he bade them a good night, and something horrible squatted on top of your wardrobe, watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten gains. He sat alone in the darkness, gazing at the dying fire and seeing faces in it. The last was so horrible and so simian that he gazed at it in amazement. It got so vivid that with a little uneasy laugh, he left on the table for a glass containing a little water to throw over it. His hand grasped the monkey's paw, and with a little shiver, he wiped his hand on his coat and went to bed. End of part one. Now for part two. The fun begins. That's not fun. That's not fun. Sorry about that. Long hair in the way. There you go. In the brightness of the wintry sun next morning, as it streamed over the breakfast table, he laughed at his fears. There was an air of wholesomeness about the room, which it had lacked on the previous night, and the dirty, shriveled little paw was pitched on the sideboard with a brief carelessness which had betokened no great belief in its virtues. Make sure I got that. All right. I suppose all old soldiers are the same. I take that as an insult, said Mrs. White. The idea of our listening to so much nonsense. How could wishes be granted in these days? Please lower the inflation. It's really expensive for eggs and milk. Anyways, I digress. We're a little bit off topic there. And if they could, how could 200 pounds hurt you, Father? Might drop on his head from the sky, said the frivolous Herbert. More said that things happened so naturally, said his father, that you might, if you wish, attribute to it coincidence. Well, don't break into the money before I come back, said Herbert, as he rose from the table. I'm afraid it will turn you into a mean, avaricious man, and we shall have to disown you. His mother laughed, and following him to the door, watched him down the road. Returning to the breakfast table, was very happy at the expense of her husband's credulity. All of which did not prevent her from scurrying to the door at the postman's knock, nor prevent her from referring to, somewhat shortly, to retired sergeant majors of frivolous habits when she found that the post brought the tailor's bill. Herbert will have some more of his funny remarks, I expect, when he comes home, she said, as they sat at dinner. I dare say, said Mr. White, pouring himself out some beer, but for all that the thing moved in my hand. That I'll swear to. You thought it did, said the old lady soothingly. I say it did, replied the other. There was no thought about it. I had just... What's the matter? His wife made no reply. She was watching the mysterious movements of a man outside, who, peering in an undecided fashion at the house, appeared to be trying to make up his mind to enter, in mental connection with the 200 pounds she noticed at that the stranger was well dressed, and wore a silk hat of glossy newness. 3 times he paused at the gate, and then walked on again. The 4th time he stood, with his hands upon it, and then with sudden resolution, flung it open, and walked up the path. Miss White said at the same moment, placed her hands behind her, and hurriedly unfastened the strings of her apron. Put that useful article to a pair beneath the cushion of her chair. She brought the stranger, who seemed ill at ease, into the room. He gazed at her fervently, and listened in a preoccupied passion as the old lady, pages stuck together, apologized for the appearance of the room, and her husband's coat and garment, which he usually reserved for the garden. He then waited as patiently as her sex would permit for him to broach his business. But he was at first strangely silent. I was asked to call, he said at last, and stooped and picked up a piece of cotton from his trousers. I come from Ma and Megan's. The old lady, startled, said, Is anything the matter? She asked breathlessly. Has anything happened to Herbert? What is it? What is it? Her husband interposed. There, mother, he said hastily. Sit down. Don't jump to conclusions. You've not brought bad news, I'm sure, sir. And eyed the other wistfully. I'm sorry, began the visitor. Is he hurt? Demanded the mother wildly. The visitor bowed in assessment. Badly hurt, he said quietly. But he is not in any pain. Oh, thank God, said the old woman, clasping her hands. Thank God for that. Thank... She broke off as the sinister meaning of the assurance drawed on her, and she saw the awful confirmation of her fears in the other's averted face. She caught her breath and turned to her slower-witted husband, laid her trembling hand on his. There was a long silence. He was caught in the machinery, said the visitor, in the lengths of a low voice. Caught in the machinery, repeated Mr. White in dazed fashion. Yes. He sat staring out the window, and taking his wife's hand between his own, pressed it as he had been wont do in their old courting ways nearly 40 years before. He was the only one left to us, he said, turning gently to the visitor. It is hard. The other coughed, rising, walked slowly to the window. The firm wishes me to confirm their sincere sympathy with you in your great loss, he said. Without looking around, I beg that you will understand I'm only their servant and merely obeying orders. There was no reply. The old woman's face was white, her eyes staring, her breath inaudible. On the husband's face was a look such as his friend, the sergeant, might have carried into his first action. I was to say that Ma and Maggie disclaim all responsibility, continued the other. They admit no liability. Oh, how fan-frickin-tastic that is. At all. Sounds like Bowie. They admit no liability at all, but in consideration of your son's services, they wish to present you with a certain sum of compensation. Mr. White dropped his wife's hand and, rising to his feet, gazed a look of horror at his visitor. His dry lips sharped the words. How much? 200 pounds was the answer. Unconsciously of his wife's shriek, the old man smiled faintly, put his hands like a sightless man, and dropped a senseless heap to the floor. End of part 2. Now for part 3. Why are you clapping? The sun is dead. Hold on.
Just so everyone knows what you're drinking, I'm sure this is a Johnny Walker Green. It's a green label blended whiskey. It's a highball, classic cocktail. Just soda water and whiskey. We use Topo Chicos with the Tiger bubbles, mineral water. It's top with a sea salt citrus foam.
All right, so it's Johnny Walker Green, right?
Yeah.
Johnny Walker Green, all right. Hey, drink up, my lovelies. You're going to have a great evening. There you go. All right, and now for part 3, the final shocking conclusion. In the huge new cemetery, some 2 miles distant, the old people buried their dead and came back to the house, steeped in shadows and silence. It was all over so quickly that at first they could hardly realize it. It remained in a state of expectation, as though of something else to happen. Something else which was to lighten his load, too heavy for old hearts to bear. But the days passed, and expectations gave way to resignation. The hopeless resignation of the old, sometimes miscalled apathy. Sometimes they hardly exchanged a word, for now they had nothing to talk about, and their days were long to weariness. It was about a week after the old man, waking suddenly in the night, stretched out his hand and found himself alone. The room was in darkness, and the sound was subdued of weeping came from the window. He raised himself in bed and listened. "Come back," he said tenderly. "You will be cold." "It is colder for my son," said the old woman, and wept afresh. The sounds of her sobs died away on his ears. The bed was warm, his eyes heavy with sleep. He dozed fitfully, and then slept until a sudden, wild cry from his wife awoke him with a start. "The paw!" she cried wildly. "The monkey's paw!" He startled up in alarm. Where? Where is it? What's the matter?" She came stumbling across the room towards him. "I want it," she said quietly. "You've not destroyed it." "It's in the parlor, on the bracket," he replied, marveling. "Why?" She cried and laughed together, bending over, kissed his cheek. "I only just thought of it," she said hysterically. "Why didn't I think of it before?" "Why didn't you think of it?" "Think of what?" he questioned. "The other 2 wishes," she replied rapidly. "We've had only one." Was that not enough?" he demanded fiercely. "No," she cried triumphantly. "We'll have one more. Go down and get it quickly. Wish our boy alive again." The man sat in bed and flung his bedclothes from his quaking limbs. "Good God, you're mad," he cried aghast. "Get it," she panted. "Get it quickly and wish, oh, my boy, my boy." Her husband struck a match and lit the candle. "Get back to bed," he said unsteadily. "You don't know what you're saying." "We had the first wish granted," said the old woman feverishly. "Why not the second?" "A coincidence," stammered the old man. "Go get it and wish," she cried, quivering with excitement. The old man turned and regarded her, and his voice shook. "He has been dead for 10 days. Besides, I would not tell you else. but I only could recognize him by his clothing. If he was too terrible for you to see then, how now? Because if he comes back, he's going to be ripped apart, my lovelies. Bring him back, cried the old woman, and dragged him towards the door. Don't you think I fear the child I have nursed? He went down in the darkness and felt his way to the parlor, and then to the mantelpiece. The talisman was in its place, and a horrible fear that the unspoken wish might bring his mutilated son before him, ere him was the escape from the room, seized up on him. He caught his breath as he found what he had lost, the direction of the door. His brow cold with sweat, he felt his way around the table and groped along the wall. He found himself in the small passage with the unwholesome thing in his hand. Even his wife's face seemed changed as he entered the room. It was white and expectant, and to his fear seemed to have an unnatural look upon it. He was afraid of her. Wish! She cried in a strong voice. It is foolish and wicked, he faltered. Wish! Repeated his wife. He raised his hand. I wish my son alive again. The talisman fell to the floor, and he regarded it fearfully. Then he sank trembling into a chair as the old woman, with burning eyes, walked to the window and raised the blind. He sat until he chilled with the cold, glancing occasionally at the figure of the old woman peering through the window. The candle end, which had burned below the rim of the china candlestick, was throwing pulsating shadows on the ceiling and walls until a flicker larger than the rest, it expired. The old man, with an unspeakable sense of relief at the failure of the talisman, crept back to his bed, and a minute afterward, the old woman came silently, apathetically beside him. Neither spoke, but sat silently listening to the ticking clock. A stair creaked, and a squeaky mouse scurried noisily through the wall. The darkness was oppressive, and after lying for some time, screwing up his courage, he took the box of matches, striking one, went downstairs for a candle. At the foot of the stairs, the match went out. He paused to strike another. At the same moment, a knock came so quietly and stealthily as to be scarcely audible, sounded on the front door. The matches fell from his hand and spilled into the passage. He stood motionless, his breath suspended, until the knock was repeated. Who's knocking at the door? And closed the door behind him. A third knock was sounded through the house. What's that? Cried the woman, startling up. A rat, said the old man in his shaking tones. A rat. It passed me on the stairs. His wife sat up in the bed listening. A loud knock resounded through the house. It's Herbert! She ran to the door, but her husband was before her. Catching her by the arm, held her tightly. What are you going to do? He whispered hoarsely. It's my boy. It's Herbert, she cried, struggling mechanically. I forgot it was 2 miles away. What are you holding me for? Let go. I must open the door. For God's sakes, don't let it in, cried the old man, trembling. You're afraid of your own son? She cried, struggling. Let me go. I'm coming, Herbert. I'm coming. There was another knock, and another. The old woman, with sudden wrench, broke free and ran from the room. Her husband followed to the landing and called after her appealingly as she hurried down the doorsteps. He heard the chain rattle back and the bolt drawn slowly and stiffly from the socket. The old woman's voice stained and panting. The bolt! She cried loudly. Come down, I can't reach it. But her husband was on his hands and knees, groping wildly on the floor in search of the paw. If only he could find it before the thing outside got in. A perfect fusillade of knocks reverberated through the house, and he heard the scraping of a chair as his wife put it down in the passage against the door. He heard the creaking of the bolt as it came slowly back, and the same moment he found the monkey's paw frantically beneath his third and last wish. The knocking ceased suddenly, although the echoes of it were still in the house. He heard the chair drawn back and a door open. A cold wind rushed up the staircase. And a long wail of disappointment and misery from the wife gave him the courage to run down to her side and then to the gate beyond. The street lamp flickered, opposite shone on a quiet and deserted road. That is it. So, let this be a lesson to you all. It's easy to want the easy path. I know we all want things our way to go super fast, but fate has something in store for all of us. Through grit and honor can we achieve our great deeds. Not words and statements, but actions and deeds. So, be careful what you wish for, and be safe this All Hallows Eve, the last day of the harvest. Now let the human sacrifices begin! Blood for the blood god!